So good morning, everyone. Kind of illustrious company this morning, and I have with me on the panel very distinguished thinkers and activists in their areas of work. David Goodhart is a best-selling author, award-winning author too, FT and Fellow of Policy Exchange, of course. But his last book, Head, Hand, Heart, was awarded Book of the Year by the Financial Times. Stephanie Leung has set up the most remarkable business called KareHero, which she will tell us a little bit more about in a moment. She's an alum of Cambridge and Harvard, where her master's was studying the impact of aging. So I'll just hand over to both of you to describe for us today where you each think we're at in terms of our attitudes and actions on care.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to meet you. So I run a company called KareHero, and our goal is to support the 10.6 million family caregivers in the country. And over 60% of them are working, and our job is to basically help them stay in work whilst they're looking after someone at home who may have a long-term chronic illness. And the way we see the state of care is as follows. There's a huge stigma to talk about caring in the workplace. There are now more people in the workforce who are supporting someone over 65 than someone under 15. We talk about child dependence in our insurance, in well-being kind of products that that employers provide, but there is almost nothing around how you support your elderly. And our research shows that 85% of all employees live about 3 to 4 hours drive away from their parents. So our goal is basically to be a care concierge in your pocket. We have an app, and what it does is it gives you full access as the adult child to a dedicated care expert at any time of day, whether it be hospital admissions or looking for a care provider. We are there to help you. So where NHS and GP can't provide support and the family's left holding the bag, we're the ones with you at 3 o'clock in the morning in a hospital corridor, or as you're trying to sort of look up on Google what to do in between your work meetings. And 600 people quit a day through caregiver burnout, and we lose about £20 billion a year from the people leaving the workforce who could otherwise be contributing. And then just one last thing, women are 4 times more likely to quit their jobs when they become a caregiver, and it starts when you're 45 mostly, which is a real shame because most companies want more women in board seats and things like this, but they can't do it because essentially the sandwich generation, a lot of women are now bearing the brunt of that.
And David, you've been looking at this for a new book you're writing. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're finding?
Yeah, I think Stephanie talks about the number of people that are stepping up, providing informal care, at least 5 million people. But it's 500,000 less than it was just 5 or 6 years ago. And I think if you look at the family in general, the family, like the state and even the market, are not really there for older people. The family is much smaller than it used to be, many more childless people, much more dispersed, as you say. And this taps into a much bigger theme, which is what I'm trying to write about at the moment, which is the undervaluing of care. It's a sort of cliche, we don't pay people enough in social care homes and so on. The undervaluing of care, not just in the public economy, but also in the domestic sphere. The way that so much prestige and value and sort of excitement and agency is all kind of shifted in the last 2 or 3 generations from the domestic sphere to the public sphere. I think that you can sort of express that in an economic formula. That a lot of care work, not all care work, obviously, medical consultants who you might classify as doing care work, average pay of 130 grand, whatever it is, but a lot of the kind of face-to-face, hands-on care work, the carer is producing, in the economic jargon, positive externalities, positive benefits for society that the caregiver themselves cannot capture. And there's a sort of gap between the kind of effort and reward of a lot of caregiving. And society used to solve that problem by making it very difficult for women to do anything else. And we've now largely removed that constraint, and I think it has produced huge knock-on effects. And there are at least 4 currently disconnected things which I think are related to that. You've got the epidemic of mental fragility, particularly amongst young people. That obviously has quite a lot to do with the fact that more than half of children today are born to couples who are not married. Nearly half, I think it's about 46% of children born in this century are not living with both, have not been living with both their biological parents when they came to do their GCSEs. You've got the baby bust itself, the fact that we're now probably below 1.5 our fertility rate, 2.1 is replacement, we've been below that for more than 50 years. You've got these huge extra burdens on the public purse as a result of the weakening of the family. You also have this huge recruitment crisis in nursing, in social care. Social care claims to have 100,000 vacancies, nursing 45,000 or something, or whatever. So, I mean, we've got, one of the difficulties with this whole area is that many of these negative, unintended consequences of a positive development, which is the fact that we're so much freer to do other things. Women who a generation ago would have been working as nurses are now probably working as medical consultants. But there's a sort of unofficial, uncoordinated strike by many millions of women who are no longer going into those. They're not prepared to do those emotionally demanding, low-paid jobs in the care industry that they used to do.
So what you're describing together is really an economic, time and social ticking time bomb. Because this is not just a current situation, it's getting worse. And we know from some of the speakers even this morning that community and social ties are going to have an additional impact. And that sounds like some of that is also missing. What are the answers to this? If we're proposing solutions and looking at how we go forward, what would, Stephanie, take you first, what would you be proposing that needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the great things that have been covered today is around preventative health. Elderly folks, for example, don't want their child sitting on them every day saying, you've got to remember to take your pills. They want to stay very independent. So how do you empower an entire population to think about their health differently? And what we've, based on the work that we do, we've realized that when things get difficult, the elderly parent who may not be as digitally native as the next generation do turn to their children and say, what do I do? So we go through very basic things like power of attorney, for example. Or if they are making decisions, so most people don't, there's something called a U-curve. So if you have age on the x-axis and dollars or pounds on the y-axis, the U-curve is the way you spend. So when someone retires or enters Renaissance period, they will spend quite a bit of money on cruises and things like this, and then it bottoms out. And then the last half is where you're spending actually the bulk of the largest percent of your wallet is on care costs. But what happens in the middle is where they've realized I need to shore up enough finances to take care of myself. But how do I do that? And I think that's a very unique opportunity where children do come in, the adult child does come in, parents are looking for advice, the ways you can actually kit out your house or understand what local community support is available, how to help people not feel isolated. And then probably one biggest thing that we're working on is we see this all the time. We get the phone call mostly when the parent has fallen and broken their hip and gone into hospital. That becomes a real game changer for the whole family because mobility is then the biggest issue and the decline of health becomes exponential overnight. And then longevity is quite significantly impacted that. So we're actually trying to encourage elderly folks to do Pilates, actually, because balance is the most important thing. So at a very basic level, if every community had a Pilates lesson for the elderly, that would solve probably half of NHS's costs for the elderly generation.
And David, this has preoccupied you. Some of the things you're talking about preoccupied you in aspects of your last lecture. So when you are thinking about policy changes or how we address this in terms of funding and so on, what are you coming up with?
Yeah, on the bigger question of the greater fragility of the family, these are huge sort of cultural trends that are very difficult to lean against, but we are an international outlier in the extent of family breakdown. The size of the single parent family community in the UK is much bigger than most of the rest of Europe. money cannot, as I say, answer all the problem, but it can perhaps do something. We're also an international outlier in the extent to which we don't support family in the tax system. We don't allow couples to share their tax allowances, and not to any great extent. We could front-end child benefit, so that a lot of couples end up breaking up when children are between the ages of 0 and 5. A huge amount of pressure on people at work and at the family at the same time. If people had a bit more financial bandwidth, then that might help. But I think and there are ways that you can incentivize the family to, when it comes to looking after families. You can subsidize granny flats, granny extensions. You could provide tax incentives for family care. Informal carers get, well, a small proportion do get a small amount of money a week, but it's not rewarded or incentivized. I do think, obviously, as you were saying, and other people have said, the fact that care packages in the UK never say anything about exercise. Exercise is not part of the sort of discourse. But I also think we can make these jobs. We can make, say, being a domiciliary care worker a much more attractive job if it had a higher skill element. Not everybody would want to do this, but you could have you could make it a much more attractive job if domiciliary care workers had a slightly higher degree of medical training, so they could make minor medical interventions, they could give injections, blood. Of course, technology would you could reduce the burdens on the NHS enormously doing that. Now, one of the problems, as I've discovered in this area, is that it's not quite like sort of Camel Laird in the 1950s, but you have huge demarcation disputes rather unexpectedly in this area of care. So as it were, a bog standard social care worker can clean and wax an old person's legs, but they cannot put on a surgical stocking. That belongs to occupational therapists. Occupational therapists are a very well-organised group, and they are. So there is potential. Obviously, more investment is needed in this area, but it's not just about money. It's also just about organising the whole thing more efficiently.
And what about, we've talked a lot this morning about technology. What about digitising at-home care?
It's accelerating.
What's happening there?
Yeah.
And are there innovations we can look to?
Yeah, so that whole healthcare in the home space has completely taken off, and I think a lot of investors have started looking at it in earnest. So healthcare in the home will, for example, there are 10,000 hospital patients who are now being treated at home, so it's called virtual hospitals. Now that sector is more about acute care. However, what we're finding is we're trying to intervene earlier. And for example, there are now, in the old, there's 12,000 care homes in the country. All of them used to be on pen and paper, and now it's digitized. Now your social care worker going in, your domiciliary care worker actually has all this stuff available digitally. And so what you're able to do is actually draw on trends from the data and be able to get ahead of, for example, if you know this person's heart rate has gone up by 2% over the last 3 days, you can actually predict, and we know this. This is real data. You can predict if someone's going to go to hospital 8 days in advance based on their 3 markers, and they could look completely fine, but 8 days from now it's not going to be okay. And so what we intend to do is then you can bring in the GP much earlier to intervene before it gets a lot worse. And the other thing is now people are looking at IoTs, looking at AI for one. I know Google's investing a lot of money into your virtual care assistant or your virtual health assistant in the US. You can now talk to your invisible friend in the room, and they can contact your carer or have emergencies or remind you to take pills, or even remind you to do exercise. And then what we're building is every couple of months we will, so we have a digital care plan, and in there you actually review it every couple of months, and we make sure that the care that you have in place is exactly what you need for where you are.
And in terms of fragmentation, I know you've written a lot about this, somewheres, the nowheres, and so on, David, the anywheres. But yes, the anywheres. We don't want to be the nowheres quite yet. But it's almost as if we in the West lost the ancient wisdoms, lost the traditional wisdoms, and we're coming full circle back, and we can only hope that we teach AI some of these old ideas. But in the meantime, what can we do about the fragmentation of communities and families, or is it too far gone now?
I mean, we have, we are very liberal societies. We've prioritised ideals of freedom and autonomy, and those are wonderful things. But in the process, we've lost the things that used to balance those. We've lost religion. We've lost a sense of sacrifice, perhaps, to others. I mean, there's nothing that makes you less free and less autonomous than having small babies, and I think, but I think, we can make the care system work better. I mean, technology clearly can improve productivity, reduce the labour intensity of some of these areas. But I think we are still going to need, millions and millions of people, particularly as the elder population grows as a proportion of the overall population. And I think we will. I think men have got to step up. I mean, nursing is probably, NHS nurses about 89% women. Social care probably about 82% women. There are Norway is showing that it can be done. I mean, we make a huge effort to promote working in STEM to women. We make virtually no effort to promote working in the healthcare system to men. I also think social care could be made sort of sexy. Instead of going off to Madagascar in your gap year, you should just go off the road and work in an elder care home. And that's sort of second careers too. People who get a bit fed up with their job in their 50s and 60s, going and becoming a manager in a care home, something like that. I mean, that's again could be incentivized.
I think what would be a useful stat to share is 40% of informal carers today are men.
Yeah.
And we've run a couple of employer surveys where the proportion, so Phoenix Group, for example, the insurance company is one of our clients, their informal carers or family caregivers who at work, they spend an average of 33 hours a week on looking after someone at home. It could be a spouse, it could be their parent, but that's a full-time job. Like 37 and a half hours is deemed by the government a full-time job. Those are two jobs that you've got. And so men and women are beginning to come out to the workforce because they really, or what we call the staccato effect, they take part-time jobs.
Interestingly, over 80, I think it becomes majority men, doesn't it? I mean, even though men have lower longevity.
So yeah, there's literally two types. So there's if it's in-laws or parents, it's normally predominantly the woman. If the wife is sick, actually, most male caregivers are actually caring for their wife because they can't prop up. And they themselves get sick, actually, for burnout. And 83% of them feel severely isolated. They can't talk about it at work. No one in the community, there's no sort of natural out in the community. Oftentimes they've moved in. And because they've given up their job, they're not drawing a pension anymore. The pension gap is exacerbated. So there's a huge knock-on economic effect to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult subject, and it sounds almost overwhelming, for both on a personal level, hearing stories, and for the society and for the economy to fund all of this. Can we be positive?
Yeah, I mean, I think society kind of learns from its mistakes in a way, and I think we may well get to a point, perhaps we're getting to it already, where we realise we've kind of over-prioritised freedom and autonomy, and that there are longer-term sort of joys and human aspects of human flourishing that require us to be more balanced when we're young, to not break contracts and relationships so easily and seek short-term gain. I mean, it's sort of it requires a kind of a sort of a social maturity and conscientiousness that, and of course we need role models for that. I think it will I mean, an interesting recent, well, not that recent, an interesting example on the fertility question is the baby boom. The fact that, and people forget that fertility really collapsed in the early 1930s. I think it went below replacement rate in the early 30s, and people think it was because of the optimism of the post-war period, and I think that the southern fertility rate whizzed up again, and I think that did have something to do with it. Actually, recent research suggested it happened a little bit earlier than that. Actually, already in the late 30s and even during the war, the fertility rate was kind of bouncing back. So I think these things are not necessarily set in stone.
Stephanie?
So I've been very lucky to have, so I've worked and lived in Japan, Hong Kong, China, and the US, and Germany actually. And some of it is cultural. So there are certain cultures where you live multi-generationally, like in India. In Japan, housing is so expensive, you tend to live 2-3 generations together. However, I think community has a huge role to play. So I have relatives who live in Japan. 1 in 3 people are now over 65. It's one of the healthiest countries on the planet. People are living way into their late 80s and early 90s, extremely independent. My grandmother passed away at 104 this year. She was out doing her own shopping until 97. She didn't have a helper. She just walked out every day and bought food and came home and cooked. And I think that But they had a really strong community ecosystem for the elderly to help each other out. She would play mahjong with someone who's 83 and she's 95, and it's a daily ritual. But that sense of daily stimulus, it actually, there's the correlation to a drop in dementia, actually, if you maintain sort of active brain cells. So I think the role of community and how the rest of the structure, like you said, the family, supports that structure is really important. Are there natural places for the elderly to hang out every day? They don't have to sit in their own home, watch TV all day. Even if it's up the road. And unfortunately, due to COVID, a lot of social clubs or local village hubs were shut down or they ran out of funding. And so care homes are trying to reinvent themselves now as not the end destination you go to, but the place you go to watch a movie with people who are also 72 years old. And it's sort of seen as a local hub. And social prescribing is far from perfect, but it's the beginnings of trying to say, how do we draw up all, how do we join the dots of all the local community things that exist to bring to life that someone isn't over after they retire. Actually, it's a completely new age and a new way of living. So there are definitely lots of success cases in society across different countries these days. And then the last one, I guess the US has done it very well, where they actually start retirement villages before they're retired, and people see it as a natural place to go to, as opposed to, oh my God, it's a bad thing. It's sort of seen as a very good thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, personally, I quite like the idea of hitting my rock and roll years later.
Yeah.
So
independent living, because you no longer got children at home.
Time in a community of friends, I think it's got to be the way. Stephanie, David, thank you very much.